Welcome to the Gray Path Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Tony B. Today, we are diving right into part two of our three-part episode. Well, it's three episodes, but it's three parts regarding the charming Madrigals. And this is, of course, based on Disney's Encanto, which is currently streaming on Disney Plus. Really good movie, great for the family. Even if you don't have family or kids, just good movie. So today, previous episode, we talked about Bruno, one of the main characters in that movie, and we kind of focused on some goals to carry into spring with us. So today we're going to dive into part two, which we're going to focus on the crushing weight of expectations, and we're going to talk about how you yourself are so much more than your utility to others. And we're going to look at three characters specifically: Isabella, Luisa, and the matriarch of the Madrigal family, Alma. So without further ado, if you want background on the movie, if you're not familiar with it, please listen to the previous episode as that's provided in there. Without further ado, we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about Isabella. So Isabella is voiced by Diane Guerrero. She has a gift. She is, other than Mirabel, everyone has a gift that's part of Alma's bloodline. And Isabella's gift is her ability to control plants. She not only can create them, she can control them. Now, Isabella is seen as the, and I'm using air quotes here, the perfect one of the family. She's beautiful, she's poised, graceful, and she always creates these beautiful symmetrical roses. She is just this ideal, this icon, this perfection that everybody looks up to. Now, beneath the surface, though, Isabella yearns for something real. And I think this is something that can really touch upon all of us. She yearns for the real, not the manufactured perfection that she portrays to the world. Every time we see Isabella, she's always well-kept hair, beautiful. We see her room, and it is just covered overwhelmingly with these beautiful roses. The house itself has always got beautiful flora arranged. Her bed comes down on vines that she controls, and she's always held as the example for other people to look up to. Oh, that's Isabella. She's perfect. She's beautiful. She's everything that everyone should strive to be. But beneath all that, she is being crushed by this expectation of perfection. She masks her feelings. So she has a very big musical number in her room when she is with her sister Mirabel, who will be the focus of part three of these three episodes on Encanto. But there's this scene where her sister Mirabel is trying to get her to hug her, and there's a lot of strife between the two sisters because Mirabel has no gift, and we'll get into her. She's kind of a pariah in of herself, but she has no gift, and she's always jealous of Isabella because Isabella gets all the attention. Isabella is perfect. Everyone's always saying, you need to be more like Isabella. You need to be more like Isabella. So she's trying to get Isabella to hug her. And that's just like a plot point. I won't go into why, but she's trying to get her to hug her. And there's this musical number that comes out where Isabella sings about what it's like for her to be who she is. And it's sad. I mean, it's a fast paced, it's an uplifting song, but if you listen to the lyrics, it's sad because she talks about how she lives her entire life with a mask on. She's always masking what she's feeling, what she desires, what she has impulses for, because she wants to be the dutiful granddaughter. She wants to do well to her family, which we talked about in the previous episode. This movie does such a wonderful job of highlighting Latin culture. It really shows how Latino families, service to the family is paramount. And that's what Isabella tries to be. She's perfect, and she feels this expectation of perfection because she feels the family looks up to her. Not just the family, but the town. Everyone in the town is always talking about how Isabella is perfect. And, in the movie, Isabella is being set up with this strapping young gentleman who doesn't have a gift, but she's basically being arranged marriaged, and she's nice and sweet about it. But then when she's getting into her musical number and you finally get to see the real Isabella, you realize that she's being destroyed piece by piece by this expectation of perfection. She's not allowed to be who she is. She's not allowed to show what she actually feels. She's not allowed to talk about what she actually talks about. And in this musical number, at the end of it, she creates a cactus. And it's the first thing she's ever created that wasn't a perfect, symmetrical, beautiful rose. And she looks at it and she says, "This isn't perfect, but it's beautiful. And I made it. If I could make this, what else could I make?" And then the musical number evolves from there, and she starts to create colors, and she gets messy and dirty. And she really, almost for the first time in the movie, she has a chance to spread her wings and really be herself. And by the end of it, she genuinely embraces Mirabelle, her sister, because she realizes that this is what it's like to be free. This is what it's like to be yourself and not be this fake perfection. And it's freeing because I look at this stuff and I think to myself, how many people, especially children these days, are living something like this? How many times, I mean, even if you have children, think of your own children. How many times do you think your children put on a mask, if you will, because of expectations you've placed upon them? How many times have you, as an employee or a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend, whom, whatever, as a paramour or as a friend, how many times have you put on a fake mask and been something other than yourself because you want that? I don't want to call it perfection, but you're putting on airs, you're putting on a falsity because you feel that that's what's expected of you, and that people will like you better if they just think that you're better, or if you're perfect, or if you're this way. So the lesson behind Isabella, when we look at Isabella, her her lesson is, we all deep down inside, we need to learn to let go of the fake and embrace the beauty of the unique and embrace the beauty of imperfection. This is highlighted no more so than in our ridiculous social media society. I know so many people who portray themselves on social media as a complete falsity of what their life is actually like. And it's because they do so because of this expectation of family or friends, or if they're influencer or they have a lot of people that follow them, this false expectation or this feeling of, I don't even know what the word would be, this feeling of a requirement, this expectation to always be perfect and smiling and happy. I mean, look at how many relationships implode in Hollywood because they're under the ever gazing eye of the paparazzi and the public. So they have to put on this fake persona. Think of how much better the world could be. Think how much. So, just like we talked about in the last episode, as we go into spring this year, we're going to focus on lessons we're learning from each of these characters. So as we move into spring of 2022 here, maybe the lesson we need to take from Isabella is that we need to be genuinely more ourselves. We need to maybe take time away from this mask we put on with the world, regardless if we're doing it because it's expected of us, or if we're doing it because we feel like people won't like us if we're not. I think instead we need to take time to drop that fake mask and really get in touch with the unique and the imperfections in ourselves and embrace that and love it because that's who we are. And Isabella learns to do that. By the end of her song, she gets to be free and it's the happiest she's ever been in her life. Now, it's important to understand that at the end of that song, she is interrupted by the matriarch of the family, Alma. Now, we're going to be talking about Alma here in a few seconds, but Alma sees her do this and she scolds her for not being this perfect daughter, or perfect granddaughter, sorry, not being this perfect granddaughter that she's expected to be. And Isabella feels bad about flexing her uniqueness, about, creating these, she created these cactuses. She did all this stuff she didn't even know she was capable of. I mean, just think about that. Think about how by really challenging what was expected of her, by dancing with Mirabella and by pushing past this fake mask that she wears, Isabella learned that she's capable of more than she ever knew she was. So by the end of the movie, she's able to summon and control almost all types of plant life, far beyond the fake, basically useless roses. I mean, there's a lesson right there. Isabella is known for creating perfect symmetrical roses, but in reality, other than for pollination purposes, roses don't have a whole lot of utility. And that brings us to our overwhelming uh, lesson for this episode, which is understanding that you're more than your utility to others. By breaking out of this perfect mold that they have shoved Isabella in, she learns that she's capable of so much more. And even one of the lines in her song is, if I created this, what else could I create? She realizes she's been holding herself back by trying to conform to these expectations placed upon her by the family and the town. She has boxed herself in and cut off her own potential. But by breaking free of that mold, she realizes, or at least begins to realize, she's capable of so much more. So, as we move into spring here, I want you all to think about ways in which you wear a fake mask. And I want you to start thinking about ways in which that could be holding you back. What kind of potential in you are you not tapping into, just like Isabella, because you're living based on the expectations and guidelines of the people around you? Moving on, I want to talk about Isabella's other sister. So there's three sisters. There's Isabella, there's Maribel, who will be the focus of part three, and there's Luisa. Now, Luisa is a character voiced by Jessica Darrow, and her gift is super strength. She's a big girl, nice, big, and strong. And she has incredible super strength. You see her picking up churches, 15 or not 15, but like I think like 5 or 8 donkeys. She's just incredibly strong. And when you meet Luisa, she is just the rock that everybody fucking leans on, because there's nothing she can't move. They can't hurt her. She's super strong, super tough. She is the strength of the family. And, she talks about how she is just, diamonds and platinum are crushed beneath her. And she's just the strongest thing that there is. But if you listen to her song, because she gets a song herself, when Mirabelle first goes to her, because Mirabelle, which again, if you listen to the previous episode, Mirabelle was the first person who saw the cracks appearing in the house and the magic failing the family. And she noticed it was affecting Luisa's door, because in the house, the doors glow, showing the magical power. If the magical power fails, the door doesn't glow anymore. And she notices Luisa's door flickering. So she goes to her and says, "Hey, are you okay? Have you been experiencing anything?" And Luis's original reaction was, "No, everything's fine. Like, come on, I'm solid as a rock." But then her eye twitches. And they play it up for comedy's sake, but it's true. Just as Mirabelle sees the cracks in the house, which are indicative of the cracks in the family, she also, that twitch is a crack in the stalwartness of Luisa's visage. And she manages to isolate Luisa away from the rest of the family and talk to her. And that's what triggers this song that Luisa sings. And again, the beginning of the song talks about how she's just this unbreakable, she can't be bowed by the burdens placed upon her. But then as the song goes on, again, it's a little sad, but it really hits home for me. She goes on to explain that she carries the world on her shoulders, but that her entire identity is intrinsically tied into her strength. She describes on the outside, she's calm, she's collected, but inside, she's this nervous mess that's being crushed by everyone's expectations on her. She just, when she loses, because she loses her strength a few times, or it lessens considerably a few times in the movie. And every time it does, this beautiful, strong Luisa cracks and just becomes this blubbering, crying mess, because she doesn't know who she is outside of her super strength, because her super strength and her utility to both the town and to the family is what she's tied her entire existence into. So when she loses her strength, she loses who she is, and she doesn't know why she just feels completely worthless with the loss of her strength. But what's learned by the end of the movie, and this is the lesson I want us to carry into spring with from Luisa, we all have our limits. We all do. And we can push our limits, but there are hard limits that every one of us has. I think going into spring, we need to take a personal inventory. We need to take accounting of the limits we put on ourselves, the limits that other people put on us, and our true actual limits, things that we just cannot do, no matter what. I think we need to take an accounting, an inventory of our limits. whether these limits are temporary or permanent limits. And I think we need to take some time for self care. Luisa's story is one about giving up all of her being to be of service to others. Now, this strikes a chord with me because, in a lot of ways, this actually reminds me of my late Aunt Joe. So I've never talked about her on the show, but my Aunt Joe was like the mom I should have had. She was a mother figure in my life. She was the sister to my father. My Aunt Joe never had any children of her own. She had been engaged, I believe, before I was born, but after losing her fiance, my aunt never pursued a romantic relationship past that. Instead, my aunt basically gave up a vast majority of her life to move back home to the other side of the house where my Grammy and Papap lived, and she took care of them, even though, she had three siblings: my father, her sister Rose, and her brother Joe. Even though she had other siblings, no one helped with with my Grammy and Papap. So my Aunt Joe took the entire burden on herself. Much like Louisa carries the world on her shoulders, my Aunt Joe gave up her life and tied her entire existence into caring for my Grammy and Papap. Well, as time tends to do, my Grammy and Papap died. That's life. That's what happens. My Grammy and Papap died way back. I probably couldn't even tell you the year. It was after the year 2000, but before I graduated high school. So somewhere between 2000 and 2003, my Grammy and Papap died. They didn't die simultaneously. I believe they died within a year to 18 months of each other. But after my Grammy and Papap died, my Aunt Joe lived the rest of her life in much the same way as Louisa did when Louisa lost her strength. She didn't know who she was anymore. She my Aunt Joe's story is a sad one, and it doesn't, unfortunately, I don't know that there's a pick me up to it, but she really never recovered from the loss of my Grammy and Papap and the loss of this caretaker identity that she had. She eventually, at me and her other friends' proddings, she eventually went on to buy a house because she was still living in the same house where Grammy and Papap both died. And she eventually went on to buy another house so she could move on with her life. My aunt owned that house for, I think it was 3 or 4 years before she died. She never, ever moved into her new house. She always found excuses. She always found reasons not to do it. She bought this other house outright because she was always good with money. So she used her savings in her retirement and bought this other house completely outright. And she had all kinds of stuff done to it. And she had, was slowly furnishing it with what she wanted. And she never moved into it. And when I found out my Aunt Joe died, which is a different story, I don't necessarily want to get into that because there's a lot of anger and stuff that go into it. But when I discovered that my Aunt Joe had died and had never moved into the house, I realized that that was a lesson that would be standing with me to the end of my days. And it's a lesson that if things in Encanto would have played differently, could have happened to Luisa. I watched my aunt give up her life to take care of her parents. And then when her parents died, because she never left anything for herself, she never left anything inside. She lived the rest of her life empty until she died. And she died alone and with no one. And that's no way to go. So when we look at Luisa, when we look at her story, and we think to ourselves, what do we want to carry into spring with us to help us grow? I think one of the things we need to come to terms with is we have to learn to take time for ourselves. We need to learn to say that it's okay to decline to help others. It's great to help other people. I love the whole point of this goddamn podcast is to help other people. I love helping other people. But I myself learned, much like Luisa did by the end of the movie, that you have to take care of yourself. There's the old adage, you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you can't. And that's what Luisa was doing. She was pouring from an empty cup. So I just want all of you to maybe make a promise to yourself as you move into spring, as the seasons begin to change and opportunity begins to open up into the world. I want you guys all to take a personal inventory of what kind of burdens you're carrying and whether or not you want to be carrying them, or if you're carrying them due to expectations and pressures of others. But also, I want everyone to take some time for some self-care. Go on that walk by yourself. For God's sakes, if you've never traveled by yourself, like internationally, go on a fucking adventure by yourself. Don't take your significant other. Don't take your fucking children. You get, pick your destination, wherever that is, and go by yourself. Take some time for you. Don't be afraid to set limits on what others can expect of you, and just love yourself and establish your identity outside of your usefulness for other people. Because if you can learn anything from Luisa's story or what happened to my Aunt Joe, eventually other people are going to move on. You're not always going to, I mean, other people may not always have a use for you. So if you don't establish your identity outside of how you help other people, when those other people no longer need you and your utility has passed for them, you will find yourself aimless without any idea of who you are. And just like my Aunt Joe, you could end up just dying alone. So that's a bit of a bummer. It's a bit of a downer note, but I do think it's an important lesson when it comes to Luisa to pay attention to. So finally, here, we're going to move on to the matriarch of the Madrigal family, and that is Alma. She's the grandmother, and she's voiced by Maria Cecilia Botero. Now, in the movie, as far as I can tell, she herself does not appear to have a gift or magical power. Now, as discussed in part one, my theory is that she is magical and that in her moment of despair, she was actually the one that summoned forth the magic that created the candle, that created their whole region, house, et cetera, et cetera. Now, she just calls it a miracle that was bestowed upon them. Maybe that's what it was. In my mind, Alma will always be the source of that magic. She is the one who summoned forth the magic that all other magic stems from, because everyone else's gifts and or magic stems from the candle, which I believe was imbued with power due to Alma's pure anguish at the loss of her husband, and the violent way in which he met his death. So Alma is the matriarch of the family. Now, Alma, in a lot of ways, I can't say that there's necessarily a villain to this film. There's really no antagonist per se. But if there was, or if you held a gun to my head and you said, okay, we need an antagonist, we've got a protagonist, I would say Alma is probably the closest thing we have to an antagonist. She is the leader of the family, which again is very, very common in Latino families. Very common. It's pretty common in Italian families too. But being the matriarch and that there is no patriarch, she is kind of the one in charge of the entire magical family. Not only is she in charge of the magical family, but the people in the town, like the non-magical people who have come to live in this town, they all look up to her. So she's, because of this traumatic burden she carries with her because of what happened to her husband, she becomes obsessed with preventing the magic from failing, because in her mind, the magic is what saved them from what was happening, and if the magic ever fails, their safe abode could come into question. Now, with Alma, she was there when Mirabelle, and again, we're going to talk about Mirabelle in part three, but in the movie, Mirabelle, who is the primary character of the film, on her fifth birthday, as is standard in the magical family, she went to touch the doorknob on this door of the house, which eventually grants everybody their gift who are part of Alma's bloodline. Well, when Mirabelle touches the door handle fizzles and the actual door itself disappears. And that's when it becomes aware that Mirabelle doesn't have a gift. She was not granted a magical ability. Now, Alma, you can tell from the look on her face, I don't think she intended to have any sort of ill will towards Mirabelle about it, but she was concerned because this was the first theoretical crack that she sees in what's happening in her world. You know, it's not a physical crack as Mirabelle herself sees in the house, but it was a metaphorical crack in what's happening with the magic. Unfortunately for Mirabelle, Alma is consistently dismissive to Mirabelle because Mirabelle has no gift. Don't want to say that she looks down on her, and I truly believe that Alma loves Mirabelle as her granddaughter, but she tells her even at one point that sometimes the best thing you can do is step aside and let those people who are special do things. That's a shitty fucking lesson to tell anybody, especially a grandchild. Alma is consistently arranging marriages between her bloodline, which is magical, and the people that are not part of her bloodline, which are non-magical. In fact, during the course of the movie, she's setting up an arranged marriage between Isabella, who we talked about at the beginning of this episode, and a strapping young man from the local town. Now, as is the case with most arranged marriages, she doesn't particularly care whether or not Isabella wants to be in this matched pairing, because in Alma's mind, her primary drive is to do what's best for the family and do what's best for the town. And that, in a way, kind of highlights what's actually going on with Alma. And that's that, much like Luisa, much like Isabella, Alma has a tremendous amount of expectation that she carries on her shoulder. She is the matriarch. She's the leader of her family. So her family looks up to her. The town, the people that have come that aren't magical, that have come to live in this area, they all look up to her. They all count on her because she is, she's the one who brought all of this into existence. She carries this tremendous burden of family, town, and safety, and she does it on the surface, at least, stoically. She never looks concerned. When the magic starts fading, she's dismissive of it, like, nah, it's not that. You guys are getting out of hand. Everything's fine. But then there's a scene where Mirabelle's kind of slinking around the house and she overhears Alma praying. And what she hears Alma saying is this realization that the magic's failing, this realization that the cracks are appearing, and problems are happening, and she doesn't know how to fix it. And she feels like she's failing everybody and she doesn't know what to do. And much like Luisa, when the crack in the veneer forms, you find out that Alma is just as human and real as everybody else in the family. She herself is being crushed by this expectation to hold everything together because she was the one who brought the candle into existence. She's the one who brought the magic into existence, or at least was at the epicenter when it was created. So she's trying to hold everything together, but she's old school. So she's used to this very, stern appearance versus reality dichotomy where her feelings shouldn't be expressed. Instead, she needs to be that strength for everybody else. But she lets that burden in a lot of ways kind of poison her. And she fails to see her family, her children, her grandchildren. She fails to see them as people and instead just looks at them as, I don't want to call them objects, but she looks at them purely for their utility. She looks at Luisa, and Luisa's, her pure reason for existence in Alma's mind is to be able to lift things and move things and do those things that no one else can do. Isabella is this icon that everybody looks up to. And all she looks at when she looks at Isabella is, you are this bastion of perfection. And that's what you have to be because everybody looks up to you and they need to have that example of perfection. So instead of maybe talking about how she's being crushed by all this expectation, she instead begins to subjugate her own family. I mean, she makes Bruno, who part one, the whole episode was about Bruno. She blames Bruno for the content of his prophecy. She blames Bruno for the cracks in the house and everything that's happening, even though he only saw that because she asked him to look into the future. She is not a perfect person at all. She's trying to do what's best by everybody, but she has lost her way by the time we find her. And what she doesn't realize is because she's gripping onto this magic and this family and this town, she's holding on to this so hard, she's actually the one who's tearing everything apart. And she blames Mirabelle because she feels that Mirabelle, it's unfortunate Mirabelle wasn't given a gift, but it was a sign that she's not special, she's not important, and she's the reason everything's failing. And these are the things that Alma explains and displays to the rest of the world. And it's all because she's so terrified, because she's scared that the trauma that existed that brought forth this magic, she's scared that if the magic goes away, the trauma could come back. And that's profound because I think in a lot of ways, especially survivors of tragedy, whether it be sexual assault or violent crime or abandonment or bullying or any of those traumas that walk with you through life, because Alma never took the time to address, unpack, and deal with the trauma of watching her husband be murdered in front of her. She instead lives in this constant state of fear where she has to hold on with this iron grip to everything around her, because if she doesn't, it all falls apart, not realizing that by holding everything so tightly, she is creating the cracks that is tearing everything apart. So when we look at Alma, what can we learn from her that we can take into spring and help us grow? How can we make 2022 better for us? Well, when we think about Alma's story, I think one of the things, as shitty as it is we have to understand that in life, sometimes bad and terrible things happen and there's no logical reasoning for it. And it's a difficult thing to accept. It's a difficult thing to acknowledge, but it happens. There's sometimes bad shit happens and there's no redeeming lesson from it. But when that bad shit happens, I think we all need to look to Alma's story and we need to realize that transferring that trauma from ourselves, so passing that trauma on, maybe not in its exact form, but passing that trauma on to others because you haven't dealt with it yourself, it only perpetuates more negativity. It only creates a vicious circle. Trauma creates trauma, which creates trauma, which creates trauma. I think we all need to look at, for me, I call it my tribe. You might call it your family or your group of friends. That group, that whoever is family to you, whoever is that close knit community. I think it's important that we need to learn to love them, but we need to allow them to find their own way and live their own lives and make their mistakes and be who they're going to be. Now, this is tremendously valuable lesson for me in relation to being a parent. So if you, the listener, if you are a parent, if you have children, or if you have someone that you take care of, it's hard, especially walking around with the traumas we all carry inside of ourselves. It's hard to let our children make mistakes or experience things that we know could be prevented. It happens with my son all the time. I constantly try to prevent him from having to experience some of the life altering traumas that I myself experienced growing up. But if there's anything that I've learned is that oftentimes that death grip I held, that being this super stern parent, was causing more problems than it was preventing. And I think that's such an important lesson to take from Alma, at least for me, and I hope it's important for you, is to understand that sometimes the best way to care for something is not to try to control it, but to let it be. Protect your children, protect your tribe. Don't allow them to do things that are dangerous for themselves or that could get them hurt, but do allow them to spread their wings and understand that you have to address your own trauma if you're ever going to move past it. Otherwise, you're likely to pass that trauma on, and then your children pass it on. And then it becomes this vicious, perpetual cycle that all starts with something that was unfair or something that happened to you that was outside of your control. Life sucks. Life sucks a lot of the times. But how we keep an outlook, how we look at life, in spite of the fact that life can suck, that people can suck, that bad shit happens. Just because people suck, life suck, bad shit happens, just because all those things are a reality of the world we live in, it doesn't mean it needs to define our reality. And that's what I'm saying. We all need to go into spring with these lessons that we're learning so that we can break this cycle of passing traumas on, so that we can be better, so that we can treat those around us better and experience love and connection on a better level. But we can't do that if we're not willing to stop, take a big look at how we act, what defines us, what expectations are being pressed upon us, and are we being true to ourselves? We need to look at the bad shit, our own traumas. Okay. So I want you, as the listener, to sit there. And I think to do it best, maybe get a little piece of paper. If not, just do it in your head. Maybe make a quick little list of the traumas that you still carry with yourself and look at each one and try to identify what kind of toxic expectations those traumas force you to place on others. So maybe you don't trust anybody because of bad shit that happened to you. Maybe you don't feel comfortable in anything. Like maybe you don't feel comfortable in crowds because of a bad experience you had. Maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing how you feel because someone once put you down. I want you to go and look at these traumas that you're carrying with yourself, whatever they are. Make an accounting of them, make an inventory of them, and then sit down and try to figure out, are these traumas being, are you passing these on in some way to those closest to you? And if you are, how can you unpack them? How can you move past them? How can you help not, how can you help break this cycle? The last thing that I think we all should take a look at, and I think would agree, is that we need to learn we need to learn to let the world play out sometimes the way it's going to play out. We need to learn to stop white knuckling and holding on to things so fucking hard, because in doing so, we could destroy them. A really good analogy of that is, and there's basically two here, but a really good one is from Of Mice and Men, the book of Mice and Men. There is a scene where the character Lenny, who was a mentally challenged older individual who's incredibly strong, he, not understanding his own strength, is trying to hold and protect this woman he finds beautiful. And because he clutches onto her so hard, he kills her. That's the reality of what's happening in Encanto because of Alma. And she's not a bad person. She's not doing this to be terrible. She's doing this because she just wants what's best for her family. And because she's so terrified of them experiencing the trauma she experienced that triggered the magic, that she's almost killing their spirits in an attempt to prevent them from experiencing events that they may never experience anyway. Like they may never have to experience what she experienced. And I get it. As a parent, I don't want my son to have to experience the bad things that I had to deal with, but I can't protect him from everything. And he has to experience the ups and downs, because if he doesn't, by the time he becomes an adult, he's not going to be equipped for the first time that life hands him a bum rap. So as we move into spring, I want us to take a look back. I want us to maybe focus a little bit more on the unique and wonderful imperfections within ourselves. Let go of these expectations of trying to be, it doesn't even need to be perfect, just of being something that we are not. We need to understand that it's important to find time for yourself, and that's okay to decline to help others. It doesn't make you less than if you turn someone down, when they ask you to help. You need to fill your own cup before you can pour and help others. And then finally, you need to understand that sometimes you just got to release your grip. You can't hold everything together. And you really need to sit down and identify your own traumas and work on them so that you don't pass that kind of trauma on to the next generation. So that's everything I have for this episode. I hope you all enjoy it. Per usual, if you haven't had a chance, please get over to the Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. Give it a like and a follow. I greatly appreciate if you are enjoying the show. Please give me a 5-star review wherever you listen to the podcast. If you could pop over and leave me a positive review if you're enjoying the show on Facebook, again, I'd greatly appreciate it. It does help other people find the show. We have one more part to this series, if you will. I don't know if you want to call it a series. We have one more part, one more episode to come, part 3 uh, on the movie Encanto, which is what we're talking about today, prefacing this all under the title The Charming Madrigals. So The Charming Madrigals Part 3 will focus pretty well extensively on Mirabelle, who is the primary character in the movie. And we're going to talk about the courage of not being special. So as always, I'm your host, Tony B, and you all be safe out there.